Bonjour à tous, bonjour à toutes et bienvenue pour ceux qui nous rejoignent. Le forum touche presque à sa fin, vous le savez, mais cette prochaine séquence va attirer toute votre attention. Depuis le début de la journée, nous avons eu le privilège d'entendre les visions inspirantes des représentants de la nation, mais aussi des représentants d'autres pays européens sur tous ces grands enjeux de défense et de stratégie. Nous avons également commencé à plonger dans ces nouveaux champs d'affrontement auxquels nous sommes directement exposés dans notre quotidien, notamment la sphère informationnelle. Je vous propose tout de suite de rester justement sur ce nouveau terrain d'affrontement qu'est le cognitif et de continuer à approfondir le sujet avec nos invités. Merci de les accueillir chaleureusement.
Ladies and gentlemen, admirals, generals, ambassadors, plenipotentiaries, friends, brothers and sisters, thank you for joining us for this penultimate event in this extraordinary conference. This panel is on information warfare, as you've heard. I'm MIKLAUCIC, formerly with the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., just retired a few months ago, now teaching at the University of Chicago and at the University in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And yes, that is a long commute. Yesterday, I had the experience of sitting on a panel, a previous panel, and was very surprised when my good friend and colleague, Dr. Nicholas Wright, said that he didn't believe that there was any such thing as information warfare. I fervently disagree. War in the English language is an old word. It derives from Proto-Indo-European roots that mean to confuse, to perplex, to sow discord. Do any of you feel like we seem in the West a little bit confused, a little bit perplexed, a little bit of discord? Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we are at war. I believe that information warfare is real and has real effects. What's more important is what our adversaries believe. Our adversaries take information warfare very seriously. This is something that's going on not just in Europe, although we've been hearing a lot about Russian information warfare and Russian effects, Russian influence operations. This is a global phenomenon. I'll speak just a moment, because you'll hear more about Russia in a few moments from my panelists. I'll speak just for a moment about Chinese information warfare. This goes back 2,500 years when the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu said that the supreme art of warfare is to win without fighting, so that even with the best technology and the most fierce warriors, you cannot win if you're not willing to fight. Fast forward to 1998, the publication by two Chinese Air Force colonels, Zhao Liang and Wang Jiangsui, of unrestricted warfare. What is unrestricted warfare? Let me just give you a litany of the ways that these two Chinese Air Force colonels perceive their battle against the West. Psychological warfare, smuggling warfare, media warfare, drug warfare, network warfare, technological warfare, fabrication warfare, resources warfare, economic aid warfare, cultural warfare, international law warfare. Fast forward again to 2003, unrestricted warfare doctrine was refined to the three warfares doctrine, which include media or public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. They are persistent, they're relentless, they're patient, and their techniques have become gradually more sophisticated, reflecting a whole society approach but is the intent and the plan of the Communist Party of China to integrate all of the elements of national strength in alignment with their strategic intention, which is to displace the West as the predominant global power. And they've been very clear on this in their own writing and their public writing. They have an institutional architecture for information warfare, which includes the United Works Fronts Department, with dozens of hundreds of employees working on information warfare. They have their Confucius Institutes in hundreds of countries, which both teach Mandarin, but also teach Chinese history and world history with Chinese characteristics, meaning there is no mention of Tiananmen Square, there's no mention of the plight of the Uyghurs or the Falun Gong or freedom of speech, let alone Taiwan. No open discussion of these issues. These institutes, the Confucius Institutes, are paired with police stations, Chinese unofficial police stations in major cities around the world, including the United States, which regulate and restrict the freedom of speech of diaspora Chinese. Fast forward again to 2022, and this information warfare is effective on all levels, tactical, operational, and strategic. Let me just give you an example of a tactical operation. China is the world's leading manufacturer and refiner of rare earth metals. They have almost a monopoly on this, which gives them a lot of strategic advantage. In 2022, a contract was announced in Honda, Texas, by Lynas Rare Earths Company, an Australian company, to mine rare earths in Texas. Within a few weeks, articles started to appear in the local press, not the Wall Street Journal, not the New York Times, but the Austin Tribune, the Waco Express, local newspapers, arguing that this mining project would be environmentally catastrophic, that it would poison their children for years to come, and it would be economically devastating for the region. All signed by Betsy Jones or Diana Smith or Valerie Perkins. But when tracked down to their roots, these articles were all originated in Beijing. They were all false information. It was an information campaign intended to disrupt the mining project of rare earth metals in Texas. Why? Because China likes its monopoly of rare earth metals. It is a strategically advantageous monopoly. At the operational level, you can just look at the narrative that has allowed China to weaponize, militarize uninhabited atolls throughout the South and East China Seas in violation of an international tribunal decision in support of their narrative that China owns everything inside the so-called 9-dash line. That is a narrative at the operational level. And then at the strategic level, I don't have to tell you about the Belt and Road Initiative with its 150 member countries, now, by the way, called the Global Development Initiative and accompanied by the Global Security Initiative and even the Global Civilization Initiative. These are all Chinese narratives from Beijing under the rubric of a common destiny for mankind and win-win deals made all over the world. Well, the question is, who's the other winner? China is winning on both sides of these, and the narrative goes on to say that this is all in response to the neo-colonial exploitative West and to create a multipolar global system. What is my country doing, the United States? Well, I regret to say that we've taken a few steps backwards. Back in the 1990s, we dismantled the U.S. Information Agency. Fast forward to the last few weeks, we've dismantled the United States Agency for International Development, the global, thank you, Bugsy, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. And it's been quite a problematic response, leaving us with no alternatives other than economic threats and military threats. What have European countries done? They've been a little bit more active than we in the United States. In France, you have Viginum. In Sweden, there was recently established the Psychological Defense Agency. The Baltics and the Nordics are very keenly aware of this. Dr. CEDERBERG will be speaking shortly about Finland's response to this. And yet, Viginum, the Psychological Defense Agency, are still very defensive. They are reactive and responsive, trying to generate resilience and to protect our intellectual space. But my question to these organizations and to all of you is, what game do you win by being on the defensive all of the time? And I would argue that we need to develop an offensive toolkit in the information domain that is legal and allows us to maintain an ethical legitimacy, but puts our adversary on the defensive. We know by now that deterrence by denial is not working in this domain. We are not deterring our adversaries from waging a relentless information war against us. So perhaps we should be, and I argue we should be, looking at deterrence by punishment. Our first panelist will be Aapo CEDERBERG, former senior official in Finland and author of Finland's first cybersecurity and whole-of-society strategy, and currently the CEO of Cyberwatch Finland, followed by Ivana STRADNER, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Freedom and Democracy, and professor of cybersecurity and international relations at Johns Hopkins University. Then Professor Gary Korn, former general counsel at U.S. Cyber Command, and currently a professor of law at American University's Washington College of Law. And finally, RUSLAN Stefanov, program director at the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia, Bulgaria, and the author of the Kremlin Playbook. Once they've all made their statements, then we will revert to you for your comments and questions. Thank you, and over to you, Aapo.
Thank you, Michael. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here in this great event, and I very much appreciate that I am allowed to speak here about the experiences we are gaining in Finland. And Michael very elegantly described information warfare and other kind of warfare we are having at the moment. Just to take a story, when I go around in Finland and discuss with people, they always ask me when the next war will begin. And that's perhaps the sign that the Finnish society is pretty calm. On the other hand, when I say that it already has begun, we are in a hybrid warfare, in the hybrid war, as I would describe it. And then I have to explain what does it mean that they calm down and the information impact is correct. It strengthens their resilience in the society. So first thing, when we speak about the mindset and information warfare is the old military saying, you have to know your enemy. So as Michael told what the Chinese are doing, then in our here at the European context, we have to know what the Russians are doing. And of course, this is a daily business in the Finnish society. We have been doing it for decades. The information warfare started much before the war in Ukraine. It has been going on, and we have been building resilience based on that. Last week I was in Taiwan speaking about the whole society approach for them, and it was really enlightening to see how similar the situation is in Taiwan than it's in Finland. So that's something what is was my takeaway from that seminar, that we should really share information and compare how and what new methods and tools are coming on the ground. But I start with the Russians, because that's the most burning problem for us Europeans, and especially for us Finns. So I think one of the strategic mistake was that the Russian Military Academy announced 2018 a paper where they told how the future war is going to look like. And they roughly, if I simplify, they divided that there's going to be new generation war, and then there's going to be hybrid warfare. They don't call it hybrid, they call it asymmetric, but anyway. And if I'm now evaluating the situation, what we are facing, so the new generation war in Ukraine is not really a new one, but it's a kinetic war. So you can say that there's a kinetic war, and then you have the hybrid one. And we, European, we are in a hybrid war with Russian. We, as Finns, we face it every day. If you are looking to hybrid warfare toolbox, by and large, you see that there are two very, in a way, spearhead capabilities. It's the cyber and information campaigns. But then there is different kind of sabotage operation. And then there is the political influence, there are the diplomatic endeavors, there are the economical endeavors. With the wars you were describing, they are all utilizing that. And I think that's more important to understand, that they have the long-standing information impact to our society. So if I evaluate information war and what they want to gain by the operations, so there are the short-term goals, and then there are the long-term goals. The short-term ones, they are more easy to fight against, because they are more clear. But then the long-term impact is really, that's the difficult one. And that's something where we have to focus for more in the future. So what are the Russians aiming at? They are having the same aim in Ukraine and in Finland. They want to have take over the political leadership in the countries, or they want to destroy the country by causing chaos and so on. And this is really something that we have to admit. That's what they are doing. Like today, there was a news in the Finnish newspapers that Sanna Marin, our former prime minister, she is guilty for the bad relation between Finland and Russia, because she was a Western representative, and now the Brits are paying to her money and gave her a good position because she did her job well and spoiled the relation between Russia and Finland. Russians are never saying that they have started the war in Ukraine, and that's the reason why Finland joined the NATO, and that's the reason we have closed the border and we have stopped all the commercial activities with them. So this is what will happen. The aim is really to have the quick wins in the Finnish society, and then the long-term wins in the long run. And that's something where we have to fight against. And clearly, something to understand. The target is the whole society. It's the critical infrastructure, it's the people, it's the vital functions and services in the society. They are our target. If you use one of the hybrid power and capabilities on your disposal, they can have an impact, and all of them have an impact to the ordinary citizens. So that's why in January Finland introduced the new whole of society, the comprehensive security strategy of Finland. This was the 5th edition. So this was not because of this situation. As I said, this has been a long-lasting impact from Russian side. And we have said long ago, we have to be able to mobilize the whole society The whole society approach means that it starts from the political leadership and comes down to the citizen level. And there is crucial role for the authorities and for the businesses, for the private sector, depending what to protect and what is the role in the society. And that's why when we are speaking about strategies, so there had to be the strategic concept. What is the strategic concept of comprehensive security in Finland? It's clear, it can't be blurry, it had to be clear and precise. So every ministry in Finland is having a task, one of the vital functions what we have described. And then there is 56 strategic tasks to be implemented. And they have to monitor their own sector. And I take here education, psychological crisis tolerance of the Finnish society, which is actually very much in focus today in this panel. So it means that the education system have to be good enough. You have to be able to educate all the people at that level that they have the capacity and they are able to read the media in the right way. They are not going. They are not misled by the information and so on. So this is one example. So then, of course, the critical infrastructure, looking what we can learn from Ukraine. Russia tried after the occupation on Crimea, tried with the cyber power and with different kind of hybrid operations to destroy the Ukrainian society. They were not able to do it. But that's the sign what we can learn here. The war, when I was still in the military college, it said the war always starts with the air operations. But now I would say the war in the future will start with hybrid operations. And now when we are in hybrid war, that's actually the reason that the level of our defense has to be higher. Because this is the fact, this is how the concept is working. And looking at the cyber issue, what did the Russians try to do with the cyber power in Ukraine? Before the kinetic operation, they tried to destroy the critical infra. They are doing the same. They are trying to do the same in Finland. Luckily, we have a good cyber defense, and we are able to fight against. So that's something to understand. But in that way, we have to be able to speak to the citizens, and in the new strategy, we are really emphasizing and focusing and telling the importance of the people. Because the people, they are in different levels of the society. They are family members, they are in the businesses, they are authorities, they are political leadership. So the people's understanding, I would say, the right situation awareness, understanding where we stand at the moment is very crucial. And then how to handle the media. Media is taking up different kind of news, and especially as we see at the current situation, we don't know what are going to be the news tomorrow. So it's very lively and very hard to take grip on that. So it's really important that all the media work together and there's a coordination, and that's what we are doing in Finland in a good way. That what are the main news for the society that we can build the resilience. Then what is going to be the future? This is my final point because I know the time is running and don't want to speak too long. So what is going to happen in the future? If there's going to be a ceasefire in Ukraine, what is happening to the hybrid operations? If the war will continue 3 more years, what will happen to the hybrid operations? I would argue that the hybrid warfare will go on despite what is going to happen in the kinetic war in Ukraine. And that actually means that AI, quantum computing, new, in a way, technical solutions, they are coming and boosting, in a way, the cyber capacities on both sides, on the defense and offense. And my, in a way, message is that a bit the same like what you said, Michael. We have to change our modus operandi. We have to be more offensive, and we have to build deterrence. The deterrence is really that when the Russians, they see that the disinformation campaigns, they don't gain anything if they do it against Finland. That's the deterrence. And then we hit back, and also in the cyber theater, that's something what we have to be able to do. And I think Ukraine is a good example. They have had good supporters who have been helping them, and that's why, in a way, cyber is not decisive in the kinetic war. It's just supporting the operations. But the cyber power is now directed to us Europeans and globally, and the kinetic power will be used in Ukraine because it's much more simple to bombard the critical infrastructure than make a smart cyber offense. So that's why the hybrid is something, and it's having a huge information impact if we are not able to build resilience in the society. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aapo. My reading of Thomas Schelling is that for deterrence to be successful, you have to show a willingness to inflict harm on your adversary. And if you do not show that willingness, you have no deterrence. And is there a risk of escalation? Of course there's a risk of escalation. There is no deterrence without a risk of escalation. But with that, over to you, Ivana STRADNER.
I'm really grateful that you call this panel information warfare, because it's really past time to call a spade a spade. And I understand that for a lot of people, if not in this audience, but outside of this theater, I'm quite certain that people feel very uncomfortable even using the word war. But whether we like it or not, in order to achieve informational superiority, we have to really think like our enemies. And Russia openly discusses that they are in an information war against the West. And they claim that who has information superiority is going to win this war. And I absolutely couldn't agree more with Michael and Mr. CEDERBERG regarding going on the offensive, because the best defense in this case could be offense. And maybe it's really past time to establish peace through informational superiority. But first of all, let me tell you how the Kremlin actually thinks about this war. And oftentimes, I get invited to talk about this subject only around the election times, which is quite really odd, because Moscow is operating in information space 24/7. They find every possible vulnerability in the Western society that they can exploit, whether it's the secession of Texas or California, whether it's the question of different socioeconomic issues in the United States, whether it's the Western support for Ukraine. I can go on and on. Some of them are quite hilarious information campaigns. Some of them are really not so hilarious. But the problem is, I oftentimes get a question, are we winning or really losing this war? And I really think that we need to shift this narrative. We should not be thinking whether we are losing or winning, because we should perceive this as a protracted war where you can have informational superiority on a day one, but maybe not to have on a day two. And Russian Ministry of Defense, I love to read their academic articles because they talk a lot. They have certain aspects for the Western audience, but they openly argue that information is a weapon. Shoigu openly said that propaganda should be smart, competent, and effective. Russian military values 4-to-1 non-kinetic to kinetic efforts. And they openly claim that in the ongoing revolution in information technologies, information and psychological warfare will largely lay the groundwork for military victory. And Russia really doesn't need to send tanks and jets to any of Western capitals, as we have just learned a few minutes ago, because of a new generation warfare, how they understand. All they really have to do is to continue to do what they are doing quite well, to use influence operations along with other parts of hybrid warfare, including sabotage activities, cyber activities, to polarize our society. But not only that, think about the Western center of gravity, including the US center of gravity, which is our alliances. That's something that Russia has been really, really good at, attacking that on a daily basis. And speaking of going on the offensive, the United States, and I will call a spade, was the superpower when it comes to information warfare during the Cold War. If you think about American jazz music and American modern art and ballet, and I can go on and on, the culture really played a very important role, including the Radio Free Europe, the Voice of America. They helped so many people in Eastern Europe to give them a hope for freedom. Russia today, they don't have to build. They do not have to have a narrative that can unite the people. It's much easier to destroy than to build. And that's what they are really good at, influence operations, to sow divisions, to make sure that the West is polarized and not united. But back then, during the Cold War, Russia was actually not very successful, not because their message around communism was not so powerful for a lot of people in Eastern Europe, but also with their alliances, but rather because it was not really easy to spread that message that fast. Nowadays, with new technologies, Russia can achieve a lot of their military objectives without a single bullet. So I always like to argue that really there is nothing new in terms of Russian strategy when it comes to influence operations. They have just changed certain things on a tactical and operational level. Russia operates through something that is called reflexive control. So basically, they feed their opponent with the predetermined information that their opponent thinks that can actually benefit him or her, but actually it's benefiting Russia. And with all due respect, the world doesn't revolve around Brussels, Paris, London, Berlin, Washington. In other words, really, if we want to be in a competition and have this informational superiority, we really have to understand how the Russian military and intelligence is operating in this and how they reflexively control the West. And once we comprehend that, that's the only way that we can actually turn the script and turn the tables on their influence operations. They like to talk about system theory and how to really attack our command and control in the information space. So I wanted to also emphasize something that Mr. CEDERBERG emphasized about cybersecurity. In Russian language, they don't even use the word cybersecurity in the way that we use. They use something that is called information security. And if there are cybersecurity experts in this room rolling their eyes, probably why I'm bothering you about those semantic issues, actually it really matters because Russia combines both the technical aspect of cybersecurity, such as, let's say, attacks on our critical infrastructure, along with psychological operations that I was just talking about. Think about 2015, when TV Mond 5 was actually attacked using cybersecurity. Surprise, surprise, ISIS claimed that it was behind the attack, when in fact the French government later on exposed that was actually linked to Russian and APT 28 group. But why does it matter? Think about the timing. 2014, there was Russian invasion in Ukraine, and that was a perfect example how Russia combined both the technical and psychological aspect. Why? Because they understood very well mirror imaging. That back then, terrorism was one of the major threats actually lingering among the people in Europe, so basically spreading fear, thinking that making sure that France does not support Ukraine. And why it matters in 2025, because there are a lot of even cyber operations that are linked to influence operations nowadays. And I don't know about every military in this room, but I do know that in our military, we actually do not combine in the way that, for example, Russian military combines technical and technological and psychological aspects of it. So what have we done so far? We have exposed a lot of Russian influence operations so far. There are numerous reports, but I'm not actually sure that those reports are oftentimes read by our friends and family members. A lot of experts in the room, I'm sure that they're reading those reports. So how do you really spread the knowledge about how Russia is operating in the information space? Maybe number one thing that we have to do is to basically explain how information is a weapon and how it actually changes the behavior of states. We have done a lot of efforts when it comes to sanctioning Russian media. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people across the world who are not happy about that, thinking that that's a violation of free speech. But we also have to teach people that there is a difference between free speech and launching influence operations that are conducted by foreign intelligence and military. There is a big difference between the two. But one thing that Russia has been really good at, as mentioned, they understand different cultures and perception management, so understand the Western societies. One of the greatest things that we have is indeed free speech, but also vulnerability that they can expose. The third thing that I want to emphasize is about offensive influence operations. And it's really funny because every time when I talk about influence operations, offensive influence operations, I usually get a question after an event when someone asks me, how do you know that we are not doing that? And I always like to say, well, if Western military and intelligence were doing that, I would not be sitting today here talking about this subject. So one of the problems is risk aversion, because offensive influence operations require a lot of taking outside of your comfort zone and exposing your own vulnerabilities. But we do not really have to spread lies because the truth is on our side. Non-democracies such as Russia, they really hate humor. So we also have that as a powerful tool. Russia also loves to be portrayed as a global power and as a country that has lots of alliances. While they're really trying to show that NATO is a paper tiger, maybe we can also use influence operations to show that the CSTO is a paper tiger, given that some of the member states are falling apart. So I can go on and on explaining like in details messaging, but we do not have time for that. The next thing that I would love to briefly just discuss is actually how Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are operating these fields. Some of those parts of a new axis, they're also cooperating formally and learning from each other. China and Russia might have very different strategic objectives, but when it comes to learning on a tactical level, they are actually really cooperating in that. And Russia has also adapted their influence operations, so it's not really anymore about bots and trolls on social media. They're also using social media influencers. They have adapted their influence operations now, incorporating more artificial intelligence in this field. So they are really adapting their influence operations. And it's not truly anymore about RT and Sputnik. We mentioned multiple times about a new rise of what Russia likes to call a multipolar world. And if you, for example, take a look at BRICS and new media that Russia has created called TV BRICS and how they're cooperating together in the global south, it tells you really all you need to know about a new adaptation. So I know that I have very limited time here to go into detail about every single point that I have just mentioned. But my last point that I want to emphasize is that truly who has information superiority is going to win this war. And maybe it's really past time for the West to adopt peace through informational strength.
Thank you very much, Ivana. We never have enough time, but thank you for those insights. And now over to you, Gary Korn.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to the hosts for pulling together this. This has been an incredible several days. I've learned a ton just attending the other sessions. I always like to come away feeling like I've learned more than I might be able to impart. So I'm very, very appreciative of the opportunity to be here. It's been fabulous. You started off mentioning your disagreement, perhaps, with Professor Wright at the beginning of your discussion yesterday about whether or not information warfare is or isn't a thing. Hopefully I can sort of chart a bit of a middle ground. I know you were worried that I might be sort of the lawyer in the room that tells you, no, 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 that's not where I will come from. And you know, we've just heard an incredible laydown of some of the reality of what's happening out there. Sort of to quote the old famous adage from NASA, Houston, we have a problem, right? There's no question that we have a problem that we need to address. The question is how you define and qualify it. The first step in solving a problem is recognizing it. The first step in fashioning calibrated solutions, I think, is properly scoping it. And I think that's where, as I'll sort of lay out, it's one thing to talk about information warfare in the sense of how we organize doctrinally within military operations, and something broader. I spent 30 years in the U.S. Army. As was mentioned, the last 5, I was the senior lawyer for U.S. Cyber Command, which sort of informs my thinking about all this at a couple of different levels. One, it's sort of amazing to me. We've spent the last 15, 20 years focusing on, thinking about, trying to get our hands wrapped around this whole new thing called cyber and cyber conflict or cyber warfare, and understanding how it operates, how it can be used as a military tool, as a strategic tool, et cetera. And we forgot about the problem set of influence, which has pre-existed the digital age for centuries. There was mention yesterday, I think, of the fact that today still, certainly on the African continent, most people still believe the AIDS virus was something that was developed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, for the purpose of infecting Africans and African Americans. That was a Soviet active measure. That was a Soviet disinformation campaign that started by seeding that story through news outlets the KGB had created in India, seeding it, spreading it to the point where it hit the main news media outlets in the United States. Well, today, just as in the cyber context, the scope, scale, depth, and speed with which that type of disinformation campaign can be affected is exponentially different, right? Which leads us to think about whether this thing is something new, or is it just a difference of degree or a difference of kind in thinking about how we organize around this. The other, we came to this realization around 2016 when we saw the efforts, shall we say, by the Russians to impact elections in the United States. And they did not limit their efforts against the US. Here in Europe, you all have seen the same thing. And everyone has sort of tried to organize around grappling with this. At the same time, in like 2014, you'll recall that North Korea breached the company servers of Sony International, right, in the US, extracted intellectual property, extracted sensitive emails from the corporate leadership, tried to extort and coerce both the company and the United States to not allow dissemination of a film that offended the great leader. And I distinctly recall being in hearings up at the Senate with my boss at the time, Admiral Rogers, where Senator McCain, among others, was quite exercised and saying, this is an act of cyber war. Now, here's where I push back on this a little bit. My concern is when we overuse the term warfare, we water down its meaning, but we also can run certain risks. Here's where the international lawyer in me comes into play. War has a distinct meaning as a matter of international law. And as a former soldier, and I think I speak to those in the room who have or still wear the uniform, my response back to Senator McCain would be, as much as I agree that this is offensive, it's a problem, and we need to address it, and we can proactively address it, are we willing to put the blood and lives of U.S. service members on the line to do so? Is it truly war that pulls you in? Because there aren't limited scope wars. There's not just cyber war. There's war, which means that if my adversary is using cyber as a matter of armed conflict or warfare, I have every right to respond with kinetic means. So I just think we need to bear that in mind as we think about this and calibrate and right-size the responses to how we think about this. Now, we do have to organize to address the problem. And I was rereading earlier today an op-ed by the former Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA, Gates, where he pointed out in 2023 that, just as I said, where we've sort of lost sight of the ball for a long time, the mechanisms, the muscle memory, the strategies that we had in the Cold War had atrophied, that we were not organized to address this strategically, to think our way through in a very sophisticated way how to respond to what is absolutely an effort to win the war in the broad sense without ever firing a shot, because that is what our adversaries are trying to do, right? And yes, it is concerning that perhaps we are taking a step backward. But I'll cite, I sat this morning through General Nicholson's discussion. It was fabulous. I don't know if he's here in the room, but he started off by saying, armies exist to prevent war, and it's the obligation of military leaders to present political leaders with options short of war. Now, here's another area that is very much in parallel with the cyber context, these discussions about deterrence, the effectiveness of deterrence, is it apt, et cetera. We, I think, absolutely, and we can talk about the legal parameters of all this if we really want to. Everyone's in the very comfortable seats at the end of the day, and if I really want to put you to sleep, we'll get into the intricacies of the legal questions, right? But we pivoted in 2018, certainly in the cyber context, to concepts that many of you may now be familiar with, persistent engagement and defend forward. And lots of discussions about, well, are those deterrence concepts or not? right? There's deterrence, as you say, by the threat of cost imposition. Do you have the capability to impose cost that will change your adversary's calculus before taking action? And do you have the will to execute and use those capabilities? That is more difficult when you are in a space that is really not so much, for me, hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is just utilizing all the tools in the toolbox to defeat an adversary in what Clausewitz would say, right, is the political discourse carried on through other means. This is gray zone activity. We can label it as we want, but are you willing to do that? There's also, obviously, deterrence by denial, and I think that is step one, what was discussed yesterday in your panel about sort of cognitive security. How are we building resilience in our societies to recognize and deal with the efforts of other states to influence, to sow discord, to disrupt our societies and cause us strategic harm? That's step number one. I don't think that is going to get us all the way there. And so there are other measures that we should be thinking about proactively. Part of that is countering the narratives. I was having a fabulous discussion earlier with Stop Fake Now, or I think it is, or you know, from Ukraine. This is hard stuff to really think about. How do you get ahead of the lie, right? How do you get ahead of the covert disinformation campaigns from the adversary? Part of that is, it's not easy business, it's sophisticated work, but that has to be done, and you have to be strategically organized to think about that and to implement that. But there is also a level of countering, right? Not just countering the sense of counter-narrative, but disrupting the adversary's ability to maneuver against you in the information space. That is exactly what we did with Defend Forward and cyber. Whatever one's view of the propriety of that, the point is, at least in my view, in the cyber realm, and I think it's true in the information space, the incentive structure is such that you can't really deter by the threat of some response. It is an ongoing, persistent problem. That is the same as in the cyber context. And so you have to proactively disrupt. It's like counter cyber operations, counter influence and information operations. But of course, you have to factor into all of that, and I think we'll get into this in the discussion, the very, very difficult question for Western democracies about the parameters of that, and when you begin to fall into the trap of simply being that which you are trying to counter, right? And the issues of not influencing your own public, not engaging in suppression of expression, et cetera. There is maneuver space, in my view, and we can get into that legally to do so, but it's just something that we have to account for in thinking about how we build a coherent strategy to counter and stave off, because I don't think you'll ultimately stop or defeat influence operations which have been going on since time immemorial.
Thank you very much, Gary. You're reminding me that back in the 70s, we had the debate over Soviet active measures, and we had some of these discussions back then. So you're right, I don't think it's a problem that we can ever solve. It's just one that maybe we'll learn better how to manage. Over to you, Ruslan Stefanov, as a discussant.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me here and putting this panel. I think it was a great 3-day experience, and we're wrapping this up. And I feel honored by that, standing on the shoulders of giants, learning all the positions about strategic autonomy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, I think we heard almost all that is out there. I'm coming from 2 experiences. One is the more recent one, which is when we produced the Kremlin playbook when we started working on it in 2014. It was only Senator John McCain that actually saw the threat. That was after Crimea. That was 2014. No one else in the US, and even less so in Europe, saw that coming. No one saw this as an issue. You know, they were all focusing on China and everything. Only Senator McCain said, I think Russia is the real threat here, and we should be building up capacity to actually deter Russia again. And if you think of it, you know, historically, I think right now Putin would see it as a great coup, you know, if he could actually pull off on the US what they pull off on his beloved Soviet project, which was winning the Cold War without firing a bullet. Nobody expected that. And as someone that has lived for my first 15 years in the information prison, I could certainly say that there is an information war going on. And I think everybody realizes that. I think now, both in the US, but also in Europe, we all know that Russia and China are at an information war with the West. The one thing that I find really surprising is that somebody could be thinking that actually Russia is challenging only Europe in Ukraine. Russia is actually challenging the American peace, the American world order. And this is where we've had countless discussions in the past 5 years with different colleagues at the European Commission and within Europe about the legal approach, which I agree, of course, is very valid. But I'll be going about this only if we are facing someone that actually is willing to abide by the rules that they agreed back after Second World War, you know, and I don't see any of these binding rules if you go from the very early on rule of law, global anti-corruption, or green transition that either China or Russia are abiding by. And we've seen the same fault line open. You know, I think one of the areas that we've come to realize, and one of the additions to the theory of this information warfare, is that it's based on the concept of state capture. You know, this is what Putin has actually actively done in Russia, and he's been exporting this outside. And I think we Europeans saw that very vividly, that through state capture, through using the judo economics power, which he also likes, which is the weight of the opponent, and using the latest technological advancements, they could actually now infiltrate each and every, as Ivana mentioned, political debate within democracies. They could actually influence and tip the balance politically within our countries, which has happened. You know, we've seen so many European elections that have been tipped. We've seen Bulgaria and Romania, you know, which are the southeastern flank of NATO that are closest to Ukraine. We've seen actual actions, economic, informational, where we've seen a presidential candidate in Romania and a political party in Bulgaria actually make it in parliament through an active operation on a Chinese social platform. So that tells us something, you know, and I think we've seen a flurry of activity on the part of the European Union. We've seen a massive, and I've seen it here too, you know, including with French leadership that has been so many times reiterated, I think, in the past 3 days. But we've also seen that we are too quickly complacent. We've seen massive failure in actually implementing the instruments that we have developed. And these are the same weaknesses that we know very well within the European Union, which is you usually go with the weakest link, because we design rules, be it DSA, you know, be it the Digital Services Act, which is a wonderful way of actually working with tech giants, or be it any other measure like sanctions. They depend ultimately on the weakest administration within the EU, not the strongest. And this is actually something that we need to work on. Enforcing the rule of law, enforcing sanctions that we haven't seen. I mean, essentially, if it wasn't the US, the EU, outside of the financial sanctions, wouldn't have been able to do that. we've been much more effective, the EU, recognizing the threat of Russian information warfare in actually dealing with that, in actually stopping the Russian state media from waging that war, RT, Sputnik, but we haven't been effective in actually stopping them from reposting that all over the information space in the EU, which happens even to this day, translated directly and still feeding into the millions and millions of feeds all across the EU, you know, all on the different social platforms, which comes to also to the fact that we've also failed in terms of implementing sanctions effectively. So we've seen each and every time that the Ukrainians are telling us, but also we're seeing this all over the Russian borders, you know, all these increases in exports, and we've been turning a blind eye. Turkey, for example, has become the largest importer of Russian oil products last year. Where do you think these products are going? We're consuming them, which means we're directly funding the Russian war machine. And we've seen this. I think everybody in this room feels this, how the real-time information flood, which China and Russia has been trying to use to their benefit, which means how they react on the front line, the kinetic war. We immediately learn what is happening on the front line, whether Ukraine is actually advancing or it's retreating, and vice versa. Whatever we do, if there is doubt within the alliance about Ukraine and whether this is right or who started the war, for example, because there are a lot of these discussions too, then you see that this decreases the capability and the capacity of the Ukrainians to actually withstand Russian pressure. We haven't seen this close correlation between this information space and the actual kinetic line, you know, being so closely together. Now, let me finish by saying, what can we do better? Because I think if we look at the democracy shield that has been created at the European level, the sanctions regimes that have been created, the different information space activities, I think they were all in the right direction. But I think we have to work paranoidly, as was in the book, Only the Paranoid Survive in the business, to actually implement that better. You know, we have the examples, we have the instruments, we have the, you mentioned, Mike, in the beginning, you know, the Swedish psychological industry. We have the whole society Finnish fantastic approach. We have the Virginum example here in France. But we need to build a strong core within Europe. And of course, it would be fantastic if we have our US friends on board too on that, because I don't think that there could be any doubt that there is an information warfare going on. And again, I feel if going back to the 80s, one of the debates in the former Soviet Union was why are the Americans so much better than we are? And one of the propaganda lines was, well, there was never a war waged on their soil. And I feel that now they feel they got this opportunity with the 2016 elections, and afterwards they got the opportunity, they got the weapons, the kind of bullets that they could actually use to wage a war on the American soil too. Thank you.